Okay, I'm going to get started with the preamble today. So hello everyone and welcome to this joint SUMS and SUPC procurement and timetabling event. My name's Claire Taylor and I'm going to be your host for today. We've got a packed agenda covering everything from the sort of basics of procurement and timetabling systems, what the process of procuring a new timetabling system might look like, thoughts on gathering requirements, and the different routes through the procurement process that you might want to take. So firstly, some housekeeping points. We will be recording we are recording today's webinar, so that will be available to delegates after the event today. This is a webinar format, so your video feeds are disabled and audio feeds are disabled. If you want to interact, please do interact with us today. You can use the chat function or the question and answer function. We're going to use the question and answers to sort of feed the questions for the panelists at the end, or to ask specific questions during the event. We're also going to use some polls, so look out for those dotted throughout. And Anne Johnson, thanks to Anne, she's going to be looking after the sort of chat function, so do get involved there as well. Time for some introductions. So next slide, please, Grace. So this event is brought to you by the SUMS group, which is made up of SUMS Consulting and the Southern Universities Procurement Consortium. And together we share a procurement service as well. In 2021, the SUMS group together had over 150 members, representing over half of the UK higher education sector. On the consulting side, we're also sort of starting to reach further afield with members in Ireland and other international members. Timetabling has been an area of speciality for SUMS for over 20 years now. I've been working for SUMS for 16 years, and my colleague Andrea Buttle before that. So this event brings together an area of SUMS consulting expertise as well as the procurement expertise from SUPC side. So to introduce to you today's panelists, so myself, Managing Consultant for SUMS Consulting. We'll also be hearing from Mark Lewis, who's the Category Manager for ICT for the SUPC. The eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that we've exchanged one Evans for another. Unfortunately, Hannah Evans from City University has had to withdraw from today's event. City hasn't progressed as far as they would have wanted with their current procurement exercise, and it's a particularly sensitive time. So she's been advised by the procurement team to withdraw from today. Thankfully, Liz Evans from Reading has stepped up and will cover some of Hannah's topics from today. And we've got Judy, really lucky to have Judy Vojkovic from Semestry join us. Judy's working for a supplier now. She'll tell you more about that, but she has over 25 years of experience as a head of timetabling, a timetabling manager within the higher education sectors, both here in the UK and in New Zealand and in Australia. So she's got some real insight for us later today. Thanks very much, Grace. You can stop sharing the slides now. So we've got a wide range of attendees today from a number of different areas of sort of university life. Obviously, those of you from the procurement side of things will be all over the aspects of procurement, the different procurement routes and so forth, but perhaps less familiar with some of the timetabling specific things that we're going to talk about. And obviously vice versa, the timetablers and those from academic registry will have we'll be wanting to learn about the procurement process. So hopefully we'll cover all of it in enough detail and with enough insight into the kind of crossovers, so there's something for everyone. In 2020, the last survey that UCISA did, looking at the use of corporate information systems, that data told us that around half of UK universities were using Syllabus Plus as their timetabling software platform. Quarter were using CMIS, 12% were using Cellcat, and other universities were using a mix of other smaller suppliers, smaller platforms. Some were still using in-house bespoke systems. and others were using the functionality that's available in their student record system. There's been lots of change in the supplier base around timetabling systems and platforms over the past year or so. We've had the emergence of Semestry, which was then bought by Tribal. We've had, on the Scientia side of things, their parent company going into administration, but the Scientia sort of resource management and timetabling company bought by Technology One. And we've had the continued emergence of other solutions in this area, either from niche areas in the UK higher education sector, Azimut, or from other countries. So products like EventMap, TimeEdit, InfoSilum, and so forth. So I will say up front that SUMS is system agnostic. So this event is absolutely about the procurement process. It's not about particular products or functionality and so forth. So today we'll be focusing very much on the process of procurement, and we will be hearing from a supplier, but it will be about process rather than product. We're going to start off today talking about the standard procurement route, and then we're going to look at the G-Cloud route in a little bit of detail. First things first, though, let's try out our poll functionality, an easy starter question for you today. We're interested in how long you have had your current timetabling system. So have you just implemented a new one? Have you had it for a couple of years, 3 to 5 years, 5 to 10 years, over 10 years, I've had it for ages, or don't know? Okay, so we'll just wait a few seconds while all of those roll in. Hopefully that's quite an easy question for you. If you don't know, that's fine also. Okay, Grace, we've had nearly 90% of people respond. So if you want to close and share that. Okay, so not many people having changed their system just recently, but over 50% have had their solution for over 10 years, and almost, well, if we include that with the over 5 years, that's 80%. So I think that confirms what we knew already, that timetabling systems are particularly sticky. Okay, Grace, if you can stop sharing that, that's brilliant. Okay, so the first panelist that we're going to hear from is Liz Evans from the University of Reading. She's going to talk to us a little bit about the life cycle of timetabling systems and her experiences of implementing a new system. So over to you, Liz.
Hi everyone, thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. I'll just give you a little introduction as to who I am and where I am at the moment. So I am working for the University of Reading as the head of timetabling and room booking. I joined the university in May 2020. That was a planned move pre-pandemic. It just so happened that I joined at an exciting time. So it was actually, I found it quite good to have joined a university in a time of crisis, because it's enabled me to ask a lot of questions very quickly that otherwise might have taken quite a long time to tease out what we're doing, why we do it, what's the best way of doing it. I'm really lucky to have a very supportive team who were already very established in doing their roles in timetabling. We've had a bit of a shuffle around of resource recently, but it's a good team to be working with and leading. So very pleased there. I've come to Reading from Abertay University in Dundee, where I was the head of records and systems, overseeing a wide range of registry activities. One of the activities that I had to do there was implement a new timetabling system. So we moved from Cellcat to Scientia during that period. And at Reading now, we work with CMIS. So I've had a pretty good view of using lots of different timetabling systems. So the first thing I want to talk about today is, I know some of you are not necessarily timetablers, so I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what is a timetable, what is a good timetable. So the timetable is a way of drawing together lots of resources that our students need. So it's going to be including the teaching staff, the support staff that are involved, people from careers teams, wellbeing teams, technical teams. It also involves drawing together the equipment that might be needed for teaching spaces and the spaces themselves, whether they are rooms in buildings. At Reading, we've got a farm, we've got cows, we've got llamas, and sometimes they need to be included as well. So the goal of a timetable is a good student experience where students can access the materials that they need to achieve their learning outcomes. But this has got to be balanced against a good experience for staff so that they can deliver the teaching in the way that they want to, and so that they have time to participate in their own research and development. A good timetable also has an efficient use of the estate and an efficient use of any technical equipment that might be needed to support that. What this means is that it creates an enormous data set. At Reading, we've got about 17,000 students, and for each semester, this generates something like 2 million data points. So it's a lot of data. So how does the timetabling software enable us to achieve that? What the software needs to do is it needs to gather together all of the data from these multiple sources, and then the outputs that it generates need to be individualized for staff and students. These days, our students are expecting us to produce a timetable which is individual to them and in the palm of their hand, and that can be quite a challenge. The output needs to be visually appealing and easy to navigate. When a new student comes in, or if you implement new software and it's new to everyone, it needs to be something that people can pick up quickly. We're in a generation now where new tech is arriving all the time, and the best tech is the intuitive, easy to use stuff. Thinking more broadly, a timetabling software might also need to include room booking facilities, because if you are running your timetabling across the estate and that's interlinked with other estates bookings, it might need to include commercial activities as well as individual room bookings for meetings or appointments. Some of the data outputs that the timetable produces are key for core business of the university. One of the things that we produce every week is a plan which indicates when the heating should be switched on. So it's really basic things like that, but also big data that helps develop the future plan for the university. So gathering all of that data together, we need to know what systems the timetabling software has got to integrate with. Generally, it will integrate with your student records system because we need to know who the students are, what modules they've selected, which program they're studying on. The student record system also needs to feed into the timetabling system the program structures so that a timetable can be built for new students who haven't yet undertaken their module selection. In terms of staff, the system has got to integrate with your HR system in some way to pull over who those people are and when they work. And for both students and staff, we need to be able to access any access requirements that they have in terms of buildings or times when they can work. Ideally, that would come from the student record system or the staff HR system, but quite often it comes from a spreadsheet somewhere. Another key input into a timetabling system is estate information. What are the spaces you're delivering in? Are there lifts in the building? What's the travel time between the buildings? What's the travel time between the campuses? All of this needs to pull together into that system. So if and when you're thinking about changing timetabling system, what are the drivers for that change? What I found is that it's often that the system that we currently have doesn't do what we want it to do or doesn't do what we expect it to do. it might be that the end product that we're churning out to students and staff looks outdated. Sometimes this, though, comes from an expectation from senior management that just changing the software will fix things. So it's worth taking a little step back from that and thinking, will just a software change improve this, or do we actually need some process changes in place before that? What are we really aiming to do? And could we achieve this more locally by making some changes first? It might be that the changes that you want to achieve then aren't possible in your current software, but I would have a really good think about why you're doing it first. So I was thinking about what the key things to consider would be when looking to upgrade or change system. The biggest thing is all of the integrated system requirements. They're usually owned by diverse areas across the institution, and they're rarely overseen by one person. They're rarely in one area. So I would say the key thing is having buy-in from right across the institution to go ahead with this. It's likely that the process changes that you'll need will affect lots of areas of the institution. So it's not just a software change for one team, it's a big process change for a lot of people. I would think carefully about the timeline for replacing a system. In my experience at Abate, it took much longer than we had planned for. And we needed a contingency plan to be able to push back our deadline for introducing the new system, and we had to carry on with the old system while we were doing that. That in itself is challenging, keeping an old system live and functioning, and people engaged in that while you're trying to push out a new one. Bear in mind that what you change in the system affects what you display to staff and students. So you need to put a lot of time and thought into selling the new system to the staff and students and preparing them for what that will look like and how they will access it. Everyone has old links stored in their favourites, and they're no longer going to be there. So they need to know how to get from the old link to the new one. The other big thing is if you are integrating with room bookings, what is your knock-on effect there to estates, portering, catering, charging for spaces? They're all going to be impacted. So work closely with those teams to make sure that they know what's happening. And for them particularly, how do you deal with the overnight switch over to the new system, where people on one day were booking a room in the old system and the next day it's in a new one? So it's kind of all I had to say, really. Procuring a new system is going to be challenging. So I would say ensure that you understand what benefits you're trying to achieve before you set out on the procurement process. Be guided by your procurement specialist, but make sure that all of your stakeholders are in the room discussing it. And in my experience, have a robust implementation plan with lots of contingency time built in.
Okay, thanks, Liz. So we're taking on the challenge, if you like, then of moving into the procurement process. Mark, over to you now. Tell us a bit about the standard procurement process. What's the sort of high-level steps in the process? What do we need to be thinking about when?
Okay, all right. Thank you for that, Claire. So I've come from private industry, so I have to remind myself frequently that when I'm talking about frameworks, I'm not talking about frameworks from my previous life. I'm talking about frameworks that are actually governed by the public contract regulations of 2015. Otherwise, I would just go rushing off and talking about how wonderful life is on frameworks in the private sector. In terms of how frameworks work under the PCR regs, the way to think about it is really that these are documents that are designed to simplify your lives, you as the users. They have certain requirements around them in terms of the fact they specify what can be purchased, whether it's goods, services, or works. They will also specify who can purchase It's not, you know, each framework has its own specific rules and regulations as to who can actually use that. Certain frameworks like CCS have a very, very broad remit. Frameworks like the ones that were used by SUPC and our sister consortia will actually specify who can and will have ability to use those frameworks. Also as well, we'll specify who the suppliers are on that framework, because you're only allowed to use the suppliers on that framework. You can't pull in other people. Another issue is we will also set out the terms and conditions that you and the suppliers will contract under. There will be opportunities for you to vary those, but they are fairly fixed. We'll set out the format of that purchase, whether it's direct or mini competition, and we'll discuss that in a little bit. Oh, and also as well, we'll set out the price lists. Keep on forgetting that one. So why would you actually look to use a framework? So you open up any buyer's guide, and all frameworks should have a buyer's guide. I will repeat this, and in fact, if I was going to have a slide, it would have my slide would have just said, please read the buyer's guide. So all buyer's guides will pretty much open up, and they will all say fairly much the same thing as to what the benefits of using a particular framework are. And that will be, they will have compliance to the UK directives and regulations, that suppliers will be checked to ensure the qualifications and that they are responsible and sustainable suppliers. They will give you improved pricing. There'll also be robust terms and conditions for which you to use. But the reality is, and the reason why pretty much they were brought in, it's to simplify the buying process. So if I just talk you through how I go about setting up a framework, you can possibly understand why the benefits are going to come to you. So typically, I will reach out to my my members and other members of the consortium, and I'll ask the basic questions. What do you want? What are you looking for? If it's an existing framework, I'll also be asking what worked, what didn't work, what else would you like to see coming into this framework? And from that, I will start to build a specification, but I won't be building that specification on my own. We'll also introduce members who will fall within from the purchasing consortia that we are involved in, but also more importantly, will become from the members of the purchasing groups, from the individual institutions, and also as well, which is really useful, is actual subject matter experts from the institutions themselves, the people who actually use our frameworks. And this is a real benefit to us, because actually what it allows us to do is to build a specification around what our members are actually asking us to do. Different frameworks are managed in a different way, but this is how we manage our frameworks. So with my tender working party, I'll build a technical specification, I'll design the descriptive questions, including the mandatory questions. We'll build the contract conditions that are favourable to our members, and also we'll set out the tender instructions. Once I've got that agreed and everyone's happy, that's when we'll look to commence the process. And the first thing we'll do is we'll issue a contract notice out to market. It's an advertisement to the market to say we are going to be tendering, okay? And if it's in excess of value of £118,000, that should go on the find a tender. Otherwise, you can just use, we will just use contract finder. The reality is that we will actually use contract finder and find a tender for all our frameworks. Just to let you know, Northern Ireland, Scotland, and Wales have their own systems for advertising tenders going out. So depending on the complexity will depend on the length of time within which we will give bidders a time to respond. The minimum you can do is typically 35 days if it's not electronic. If it is electronic, it is 30 days. There is a way of reducing it to 15 days, but there are different rules for that. One thing you have to remember is that you are going to get clarification. So on frameworks, we can expect somewhere in the region of 200 responses, and I've had higher. And those responses are not just about the specification, they will be also about the process. And in fact, many of them will be repeating questions that other people have been asked. So you have to build that into your timelines. You have to understand and make sure that you've got sufficient number of people around you to support you in that activity. Once you've gone through that, we then come to the evaluation process. The regulations require us that we must follow a format called most economically advantageous tenders, MEET. And this is where we're not just assessing on price, but we will also assess on non-price criteria. That could be product knowledge, customer service, added value, contract management. Once we've completed the evaluation, we will then notify all the bidders who have responded to that tender. And just by way of an example, we actually ran one particular tender where we were looking in excess of 50 responders coming back to that. The tender itself had in excess of 200 questions, so you can imagine how difficult that was going to be. Once we've notified the suppliers, we then go through what we call standstill. This is a period of about 10 days, which just allows all the bidders just to review what the information that's been given to them, and also as well give them an opportunity to actually ask some further questions and challenge as to why a particular decision has been made. I'm not going to talk about that because it still gives me nightmares from the first time I actually ran a tender. But there is that as a particular issue you need to be aware of. So we've set up a framework. As you can see, it's not a simple process. It's very long-winded. It's quite complicated, and there are significant numbers of ways within which we can fall foul of the regulations. But we do that for our members, and other frameworks are exactly the same. And this is why I say we simplify the process. So going back, again, to understand how you can procure under a framework agreement, you will have to read the buyer's guide. And the buyer's guide will set out all the different options you have. And I will talk about the typical options that I offer under my frameworks. Some frameworks will deal with them differently or have reduced options. So,
Mark, can I just?
Yeah.
I'm just going to come in. We've had a question from the floor, as it were. In terms of the frameworks, absolutely, we set those out. And is it a similar process? It sounds like a very similar process for individual institutions. I don't think there's a single framework for timetabling systems at the moment. So talk to us a little bit about in the individual. Are you going to talk to us a little bit about the procurement process outside of a framework?
Actually, I was just about to come to that.
Okay, perfect. That's fine.
Okay.
Sorry, we had a question about that.
Right. Yeah, I noticed that. So each framework will provide you with the different routes within which you can go about it. Okay. I'll just to explain. There are going to be occasions where a framework is not suitable, and in those instances, yes, you are going to have to go it alone. Okay. And actually, the process for a framework is pretty much the same, within which you, as an institution, will need to go out to market. You will need to actually undertake that whole process of creating your documentation. You will need to go through that process of issuing your contract notices. You will need to go through that process of issuing your award notices and your standstill, etc. And actually, that you don't have to do that with the framework. Okay, so with framework, and specifically with my frameworks, actually, so the easiest and simplest way of awarding is actually called the direct method. My frameworks are ranked, some aren't, but my frameworks are ranked. So what that allows you to do is, as an institution, is to go to the top ranked supplier and actually say, I want to buy, and think in terms of, say, particularly software, is actually say, well, I want to buy 1,000 Adobe licenses, and that's it. It's everything is set up for you. You have your price list, you have your confirmed supplier, you simply issue your order to the supplier that you've agreed that you're going to buy from, and then from there and make reference to the standard terms and conditions, and that is it. It literally is that quick and simple and easy. You don't need to do anything more. You don't need to enter a standstill period. The only thing you may actually have to do is, in terms of value, got a bit of a brain fade, I think it's over 25,000, is that you may have to issue an award notification to the market. So you would use Contract Finder or Find a Tender to say who you've awarded to. Don't quote me on the 25,000. I'll make a note to myself, and I'll come back and just confirm that at a later date. Okay, so that's for a standard purchase. We have there is another format which other frameworks use, and that's called we call this desktop calculator. Another way of describing it and thinking about it is just a option B for direct award, and that just allows you to vary some of the criteria. And the framework agree, and the buyer's guide will actually specify the rules within which you can flex up and flex down those criteria. And again, it's once you determine which supplier you're going to use, using those revised criteria allows you then just to go and direct award back to that criteria. Again, no standstill, no evaluation, just simple, straightforward approach to buying. The more complicated method, and you would use this if you've got a non-specific specification that's slightly different from what's in the framework agreement, or alternatively, if you're just looking for price and you want to focus more on price, because as I mentioned earlier, with the frameworks that we run are evaluated on most economically advantageous tender. So my frameworks may have 40% price, 60% looking at the supplier. It varies depending on who that is. With further competitions, you are allowed to vary between 10 and 90% those criteria. You still have to follow the criteria that have been set out. You can ask further questions, but you just have to be careful. To get a better understanding of the process, the easiest way is to read the relevant buyer's guide for the framework that you are using. Benefits of this, there are still an awful lot of benefits. As I said, when I'm running my tenders, I have a specified minimum period of time within which I'm allowed to actually, I must allow the suppliers time to respond. When you're using mini competition, that is just defined within the regulations as reasonable. So if it's price, you can do it very, very quickly. If it's something more complicated, yes, of course, you are going to need to extend that and make that available. Okay, but again, there is no standstill requirement available. And also as well, because you're dealing with a small pool of suppliers, you've got the benefits of that. You're less likely to have challenges, etc. So, okay. So, very, very quickly, when can I use a framework? Well, actually, you can use a framework at any point you want to. They're designed to make the process simpler and easier for you. As I said, not every time will there be a framework that will be best for you, coming from myself. But don't forget, you've got other framework providers like the NHS, CCS, JISC, etc. And there's also the Open Framework. If you have problems, if you need assistance, the fun thing is when do you contact purchasing? You call us whenever you want, okay? We're here to help, we're here to provide the best service that we can. If you've got an issue, don't hesitate. You can either contact your local consortia procurement manager, or you could just come to me direct. Okay, Claire.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much, Mark. Time for our second poll now. We're interested in finding out how many of you have recently used any form of this. So not G-Cloud. We'll ask a question about G-Cloud later. But if you've used any form of the standard procurement process recently, and by recently, let's talk about 5 years being recent, given what we saw about the changes in timetabling. And there's a couple of different answers there, just to see if we've got that sort of spread across timetablers and procurement experts. We're expecting them to have used the sort of standard systems procurement mechanisms. Okay, so we'll just give you a few more seconds to answer that. Okay, so Grace, if you could close that down, and we'll have a little look at that. So just over 40% have never used the sort of standard, been down the standard procurement route. So there's definitely a possibility for some support. And if people haven't done it for 5 years as well, then definitely some information there, and about 20% from the procurement side and 17% from timetabling. Okay, thank you very much, Grace. You can stop sharing that. So in terms of the sort of stages in the process, Mark set out the kinds of stages that you as an institution will also have to go through, which is similar to the way that we would go about, SUPC would go about setting up a framework agreement. I'm going to talk briefly about the sort of process of gathering requirements and how we start to think about those. Judy's going to talk in some more detail based on her experiences in HE, but SUMS has supported many of our members over the years in articulating the requirements they have for systems, whether that's in timetabling systems or in other systems. Timetabling, I think, is a particularly complex area. There's so much difference across even single organizations in terms of sort of processes and policies. We've seen a lot of work to consolidate that, but we still see differentials there. The data and systems landscape are incredibly complex. Liz talked to us a little bit about that. So it's going to be difficult, and it's going to be time consuming. There's also something interesting about the kind of annual process that's involved in timetabling, and yet which is ever rolling, and yet we are trying to specify a really complex set of requirements that's going to need to remain static for a period of time while we go through the whole process. So some generic recommendations for me. Liz talked about stakeholders. That's essential. Map out all of the stakeholders. They may be direct stakeholders in that they're going to use the system, or they're going to see the outputs of the system in personal timetables, whether that's staff or students or technicians and lab support staff and all of that. There may be a large number of indirect stakeholders, though, who may be using some of that data downstream, or may be responsible for upstream activities. So map out those stakeholders, think about how you're going to engage with them to find out what they need. The user journeys are a good popular mechanism at the moment of ways about talking about what users do, what they're going to want to be able to do with the system, what their needs are, what their wants are, and being really clear about the difference there. I think it's really important to place systems into the sort of systems architecture, the systems landscape now as it currently sits, but also find out what else is happening. You know, what are plans for other key systems. Think about where data is mastered and how it moves around the system and what you're going to use it for. I'm really keen on a RAKID approach to business information management. So RAKID it's an acronym, RAKID. Start with the R, it's about results and outcomes. The A is actions or decisions that need to be made. So we're very much focusing on what we need, what we want to get out of our systems and how we want to use our data before we then think about the information and data that's needed to support that. And one last thing I would say, I'm working with the University of the West of England at the moment. It's a procurement, they're going through a procurement exercise for a apprenticeship management platform, and we're supporting them in the business requirements phase of that. Huge documents, functional requirements documents, user journeys from multiple stakeholder sets. The data and information dictionary is huge, and just to make sure you've got enough time in that process of gathering requirements to be able to properly cross-reference all of that, to be able to go back to stakeholders. You said this, but in the other document, it's this. So how we cross-reference that and make sure that we've got a really clear picture of what it is. I'm going to hand over to Judy now. Talk to us a little bit from your sort of higher education experience, Judy, about that sort of process of gathering requirements, the start of the tender process.
So just to start a little bit, a little bit about me. So I've got 25 years experience in higher education, as you can probably see from the grey hairs. I've worked in timetabling for most of that, New Zealand, Australia, and since 2010 in the UK, as Claire alluded to. I've managed several strategic projects, done process design. I've used quite a few timetabling systems over the years. I've managed multiple tender projects and implementations for a range of universities in the UK and also in New Zealand as well. In August of this year, I decided to step across the divide and go to what I have since learned is referred to as the dark side, and joined Semestry. But I also work with eCentral, the training company. I deliver their training base camp and other courses. So I'm going to start with my HE hat on and talk about capturing requirements from that side. So where to start? Well, as Claire has alluded to, it's really important to do lots of research, talk to your colleagues in other universities. Timetablers are quite well connected in the UK, so take advantage of the networks like JISC and various things like that to talk to your colleagues about their experiences. I would also recommend, and I've done this a number of times, having informal chats with suppliers before you even start thinking about what your requirements are. You can get them to give you an overview demo so you can get to see what's out there in the market, because if you're using a particular system, we tend to think in that system's terminology and the way that system works. So it's a good idea to see what else is out there, because I think it's Claire alluded to, technology is always developing, so there may be things that you're not aware of. It's good to have this informal chat too, because you can also ask for indicative costs at that point, and that can be really useful when it comes to planning your budgets and things like that. How would you decide on a tender method? Well, my first protocol would be always go and talk to your procurement department. There may be regulations at the university that dictate which one you can use. Often that's linked to pricing as well. So definitely they're the first protocol. Get their advice and read the buyer's guide, which Mark was alluding to. The average cost of this is the internal cost of a tender in the UK, is about £50,000. That's a lot of money. It does take a lot longer than people expect, as various people have mentioned. So if you do have other alternatives or other options to use a quicker process, it's certainly worth considering them, because that's a lot of time and resource of internal staff to actually dedicate to the project. So what do you do when you're developing your requirements? Well, in my experience, this is going to sound really obvious, involve your timetablers as much as possible. You'd be surprised how many universities don't seem to do this. And it's really good to just, they're the people on the ground. They know the pain points. They know where the complexities are. They know where the manual workarounds are as well. So they'll no doubt have lots of great ideas for things that could actually be improved. And as Claire has talked about, make sure you're identifying all of the key stakeholders. We do tend to sometimes forget those downstream systems and the users of those that are using the timetabling data. Certainly have a lot more of those than we did 15 years ago. You know, we've got attendance monitoring, building management systems, various other things that are using that timetabling data. So they're all going to be affected by system change. So it's really important to talk to them as well. Personally, I always like to run formal brainstorming workshops with different groups of people to get lots of ideas around, ideally, what would you like to see? Let's not even think about what we're currently doing. Let's think about what we'd like to see. It is a bit labour intensive. Tenders, by and large, are very labour intensive. If you want to get it right, though, it's worth investing the time at this stage, I think, to make sure that you are actually looking at the big picture and thinking about everything. So what to do first? Well, I'm a bit of a data geek, as anyone who knows me will confirm. So I would always start by looking at your data. Where is it coming from? Which systems upstream is it coming from? How are we using it in the system? And then where is it going to? It sounds like a lot of work. It's not actually as much work as people think, but that can save you so much time later on, particularly when you come to implementation. It can also really easily identify those manual process pain points as well. So lots of chance to identify what you can improve. As I said, think of the big picture. Timetablers, by their very nature, are detail people. We love to get the detail right. So sometimes it can be a bit difficult to get us to think about the big picture, but it's really important that you do that. And having those informal chats with suppliers can help you, I guess, see what's out there as well. And my final one is, and I guess since I've come to Semestry, I see this quite a bit actually. Don't allow your current system to dictate the process. So just because you're doing something in a certain way now, there might be other ways, better ways, more efficient ways of doing it. So don't try and just replicate what you're doing now in your system requirements. Do take that bigger picture view. Also with the requirements, there's a couple of ways that you can actually format them, and that will influence the quality of the information that you get. And I don't think one's better than the other, they're just different. So it's important to think about this when you're actually coming to structure them. So one way to do it, which is quite common, is to use Excel or a table in Word and have a list of very closed questions around specific things that you want the system to do. So that's kind of an example of what it might look like. And then you ask the supplier, can you do this or not? And you give them a little bit of space to write some information about it. And that's great if you know specifically what you want. It certainly makes scoring a lot easier because it's either yes or no. So you know whether to give them the points or not. But sometimes it does stop suppliers adding additional information. There may be additional functionality that you're not aware of, that because they have to say yes, no, and talk about just that point, they're not going to get the opportunity to put that in. So it's just bear that in mind, that you might miss out on some details or extra information that you're not aware of. The other thing to do is if you go to your IT department, they might say, oh, look, we've got a standard template of the requirements for an IT system, and they'll give you that. And that's great. If you're going to use them, just double check that they actually apply, because if you're looking for, say, for example, you're looking for a cloud system, and IT requirements will frequently have requirements that relate to on-premise systems. So just make sure that you're not putting requirements in there that are actually not going to be applicable for what you're looking for. And if you're not sure, then the IT technical people will be able to help you with that. The other way of doing it is to use open questions. That's usually just a Word document where you basically just have a list of questions and the supplier replies to them. And this is an example of the type of open question. So you're just asking a very general question so the suppliers can talk in detail about how you would do that within their system. It does provide the opportunity to get that information about things you might not be aware of. The downside of this is it makes scoring a lot more complex, because obviously, you're not comparing specific yes, no's. So if you're going to do this, what I would recommend is developing a scoring matrix for each question, allocating points for the minimum that you want to see as an explanation, and then allowing also a couple of points for anything that you might not be expecting that might be there. So as I say, one isn't better than the other. They're just different. It's just something to think about in terms of how you want to gather that information. The other thing that I will just talk about finally, my experience in HE, and this is particularly from a tender I was involved in with the New Zealand university. Actually wasn't for a timetabling system, it was for an HR system. So usually you have 3 areas of sort of a score that you bundle up together. So you have your requirements, all of those individual things that you want the system to do. You have the price, and then you have that sort of general company information, which Mark was alluding to before, like reputation, financial situation, experience, support, all of those things that you give a score to. It's really important to get the balance between them right. The university I was working at in New Zealand unfortunately didn't, and they gave quite a high percentage to the price. So what they actually ended up with, because obviously you add up the score and someone has the highest score and they win the tender, they ended up with a system that didn't actually meet, I think it was like a third of the requirements that they had, those specifications, because they'd put such a high weighting on price. So I would just warn you to make sure that you've got that balance right between the 3, because not just price, but those things like support, ongoing support, the ongoing relationship, that's really important as well. So it's important to make sure you've got the balance there right. And that's me for this bit. Is there any specific questions relating to that that's come up?
The key question, Jeannie, was, are you happy to share your slides afterwards?
Yes,
of course. I think the answer is yes.
Absolutely. Excellent. More than happy.
Excellent. So I'm going to ask Judy, I'm going to ask you to change your hat now. So if you take off your HE hat and you pop on your recent dark side supplier hat, talk to us a little bit about the procurement process from the supplier side. I mean, when do you, I guess, find out that the institutions are looking for a new system, and what does that process feel like from the supplier side?
Okay, happy to do that. So, okay, yes, hats duly changed. So from a supplier's perspective, when do we find out? Well, if you're going to have those informal conversations, we may know ahead of time before you actually go live. As I said, everybody knows everybody in the UK in terms of timetabling, which is quite different for me when I arrived here, and it's great, but it does mean that we do tend to hear through people that we know that you may be considering, you may contact us directly. So if we've had that informal chat and demo, then obviously we will be in the loop, we will know to be looking out for it. If we don't have that, then suppliers sign up to the various tender systems, those portals that everybody uses. And if you put a tender up as live, we will receive a notification from that system that there's a new tender up there. Also, so in my experience, procurement department will often ask you, as the person running the tender, is there any suppliers that you would like us to formally notify as well? So you can give a list of people you would like to make sure that they're aware of it to your procurement department, and they will handle that for you as well. What is typically in a tender? I've talked about this a little bit from the other side. So there's that company information, which is around the financials, the pricing, the support, and there is the specifications, those requirements, which most people tend to group into these 3 categories. So you've got functional ones which specifically relate to the timetabling part, so applying constraints, all of those kind of things. You've got the technical IT ones around architecture, security, interfaces with other systems, and then you've got the ones that don't fall into either of those categories. So they tend to be called something like non-functional, and that can be any legal requirements to meet data protection laws or other things that you want to include. Sometimes if it's a tender from another country, they will include things like language and other things in that section as well. It's quite a lot of work and it's quite a lot of documentation. So I know that Several people have already said this, but please make sure you build in extra time for this kind of process, because you want to get it right to make sure you end up with the right result. So once we receive a notification, what then happens? Well, the first thing we do is we will log into the whichever portal the tender is in, and we will download all of those documents. We will read everything thoroughly. We will make a list of everything that we need to do and when we have to have it done by. We will also identify anything that we need to clarify. Sometimes it's not really clear what people are asking for in particular things, so we will identify anything that we need more information about. The next thing we do is we then submit any of those questions. I think Mark alluded to the fact that you get asked lots of questions. In my experience, when any supplier submits a question, the answer goes to everybody who's registered, so it will go back to all suppliers. So just when you're writing your response, bear that in mind, it's going to everybody. Hopefully that will save you being asked repeated questions. Once we've got those clarifications, then we go about actually writing the tender response. This is a lot more work than people think. It's just as there's a lot of documents to prepare from your side, there's a lot from our side as well. It involves colleagues from across the organisation, so I have to speak to technical people around those technical specifications and implementation team about the timelines for implementation and things like that. And it's my role at Semestry to bring all of that together and write it all up, which can run to 20,000, 30,000 words. It's a lot. And then prepare all those documents and double check and double check and double check again. And then we submit the tender response. What happens next? Once the evaluation begins, there's usually several, those that make it to the next round, those suppliers, we get invited to do a demonstration of their software. If you're, this is quite an interesting process, because usually we get about an hour to an hour and a half. It's not really very long. Certainly to show every aspect of any piece of timetabling software would take significantly longer than that. So from the university's point of view, what I would do here is, if you have particular things you want to see, or you've got some scenarios that you'd like to see how the system would handle that, build them into this part of the process, because it helps us know exactly what you want to see as well. At any point during this evaluation process, we may get asked for further information or to clarify what we've written, and that happens during that process. Then you have a decision and an announcement and a cooling off period, and someone is named the preferred supplier. And at that point, after the cooling off period, you may be asked for further clarifications as the preferred supplier. This is when contracts negotiations start. Then hopefully the contract's signed, and then implementation begins. That's quite a long process of some months. It can take many months from the decision to actually the implementation. So I know we've said that repeatedly. Make sure you allow enough time. So what does a good tender look like from a supplier's point of view? Well, if you give us background, it's really helpful. It gives us that context. So tell us things like, how do you timetable? What's your process? How do students get your timetables? Do you have a centralized team? Are you based in departments? How does that work? Also, any objectives that you have for the project itself. Often, in my experience, timetabling system review tends to come up as part of a wider project around student experience or digital enhancement or something like that. So if there is a wider project, let us know what the goals are. It helps us give context to what you're asking for and make sure that we understand what you need. If you have timelines, please include them, because that also helps us, particularly if you're saying ideally we want to start implementation here and go live with the system at this point. It helps us when as part of the tender, we usually have to submit an implementation plan. It means that we can look at when you're wanting to do it and make sure that it works. I guess clear instructions, it sounds really obvious, but the number of tenders I've read which are a bit confusing, they seem to contradict themselves. So please get lots of people to read your tender, make sure it makes sense and that you're not asking for something in one requirement and then contradicting it in another. If you've got key terminology, it's really great if you get a list of what your key terminology is, and then we understand exactly what you're asking for. And this sounds lazy from a supplier's point of view, but some tenders require us to submit 15, 20 different documents. So if you give us a checklist of what you're looking for, from your point of view, it means you'll get it. We won't miss anything. So that's quite helpful. I would normally draw one of those up for myself anyway if there isn't one, but it is quite helpful from your point of view to make sure you're going to get that from everyone. And my last thing of what good looks like is it's not just a yes, no. Believe it or not, we do receive tenders which they have a requirement and there's a yes, no, and there's no room for explanation or clarification at all. And sometimes it's like, well, it's a yes to some of it, but it's a no to others. Which are we going to choose? We've got to choose one or the other. It means that the quality of the information we submit is not as good as it can be for you. So I would encourage you to try and avoid just yes, though. In terms of your requirements, I've talked about this, the language of those, please be as clear as possible as you can in your explanation. Try to avoid current system jargon. It's something that as a timetabler, I always used to do as well. If you've got a particular system, you use certain terminology. And in fact, when I read a tender, I can often pick which system people are using just from the way they've phrased things. So try and avoid that, because what you're actually doing is it's restricting yourself to what your current system can do. So think bigger, as I've already said. Sometimes if you're going through the table with the individual points, try to avoid having multiple questions in the one specification, because as I say, it may be yes to some of them and no to others. And if we have to say yes or no, at least if we can put an explanation in, we can, but it just makes it clearer for you in terms of how do you then score that if it's a partial yes. So yeah, try and avoid having that situation occur. If you've got something that's really complicated in terms of your requirements, give us an example of when you might use it. Again, that gives us more context of what you're trying to achieve. So that's helpful. And this is something I would say with both hats on, to be honest with you. When you're going to tender, it's important to remember it's not just a software system that you're purchasing. You're actually, and I think several people have put this in the chat already, it's about your ongoing relationship with your supplier and the support that you're going to receive and their commitment to development, customer engagement. So what you need to do is make sure that you're building in measures for all of that into your system, not just focusing on what can the actual piece of IT do. So my tips and hints for suppliers' perspective. We'd really love it if you gave us at least 3 to 4 weeks between going live and actually your deadline. Frequently, we're working on multiple tenders at one time. And as I've said, it's a significant amount of work. It's about 30,000 words. It's a lot. And it's not just because no two tenders are the same. You can't just take one and recycle it. We have to start from scratch with every single one. So if you want to get really good information, make sure you have a decent amount of time for us to prepare things. Also, sometimes we have to source lots of other documents that we haven't already got. I know with us, because as Claire alluded to, we are now owned by Tribal. Sometimes I have to go to Tribal and ask for certain documents, and that all takes time. And yeah, allow 6 to 8 months. That's just for that's not for the implementation. I'm talking about the actual tender process. You've got to allow plenty of time to get your requirements together and get everything in place before you actually go live. I have worked at universities where it's taken more than that. In fact, sometimes years to get to the point where we can actually go live. I would recommend the informal engagement. As I said, it gives you that indicative pricing, which can be really useful for planning your budget. And you do get a feel for what's out there. So you do know what's possible. Obviously, your internal resourcing, it's never too early to think about that. There's not a lot of timetablers out there. So if you need to backfill your timetablers, that can be quite tricky. And my last tip is bear in mind with a formal tender process, you do have this 10-day cooling off period. So once you've announced who the preferred supplier is, there's a 2-week window where you can't engage with them. You can't start talking about implementation or contract negotiations or anything. So just factor that into your timeline as well, because it's like a 2-week window that you won't be able to use. Any questions on?
We do have a couple of
Okay, cool.
couple of questions. I'll just see if there's any that we want to ask now, or people can also vote on those questions, make sure that we answer the right ones at the end. So somebody asked, as a supplier, when do you get the opportunity to say whether you feel that the tender has scope for innovation which has not been noted? So I think you talked a little bit about that sort of yes, no, and closed questions. But do you get the chance to go back and say, do you know what? There's this whole different way of doing this, or do you not?
It's a bit. It depends on the tender. Sometimes there is a section where they say, "Is there anything that you can do on top of what we've asked for?" And then we would obviously have the opportunity there. If not, we might try and squeeze some of it into a management summary at the front, but then there's no guarantee that the person that like the timetablers or whoever's going to be doing that scoring is even going to score that management summary. So it's tricky. Yeah. Sometimes we literally would not be able to, if it's a very prescriptive form, which has this question, this box, and there's no room for you to add anything outside of that, then we wouldn't get that opportunity. So we are very much restricted by what we're asked to submit.
Okay, I'm going to hold the rest of the questions for the end, and I'm going to let people have a bit of a vote on some of those questions, so that so we answer the key ones at the end. So that's a bit about the standard route for procurement, but universities have been starting to use G-Cloud as a framework for procuring systems, cloud-based systems. Spot the name there. So Mark, if you could tell us perhaps briefly, just running over time a bit, about what G-Cloud is, what makes it different to the sort of standard procurement pathways.
Okay, so I think the first thing to understand about G-Cloud is it's massive. Okay, and to put it into context, there are in excess of 5,200 suppliers on this framework. Okay. And there are in excess of 31,000 cloud services on offer. Okay, it's broken down into three distinct lots. Lot one is to do with cloud hosting, so that's your infrastructure and service as a platform. Lot two is your cloud software, so that's your SaaS, software as a service. And lot three is cloud support. So this the services to help buyers set up and maintain their cloud software. I've seen in the chat actually that this question, do we actually have a timetabling framework? The reality is that no, we don't. Within our own area of procurement, we have the SLRA, but actually cloud software, the SaaS, actually may be a route for people to actually, if they have any specific requirements that sits outside of the available frameworks within our own consortia. Actually, this may be a route, and so and I don't know if people are aware, but the way in which you will actually look at searching is quite interesting on cloud, because it is so large. You start off and you gradually build up your different criteria, so you're narrowing your search down and down and down and down. It can be that you can actually get to a specific supplier, but more often than not, actually what you will end up is a range of suppliers, 3 to 5 suppliers available, who are able to actually offer the services that you are particularly looking for. Just as a reminder, the G-Cloud is specifically to cloud-based services. So you won't. So whilst you may get a timetabling provider like Tribal, etc., Semestry on that. In fact, I think they are actually. But what you actually, I've just advertised that. But what you will actually find is you will get a greater range, okay, but they may not be specifically HE related, okay, if that makes sense. You know, as I said, it is absolutely massive. You know, it gives you such an access to a vast number of suppliers and services. Yes, you can do direct procurement through there, as I mentioned, because it's the G Cloud is refreshed on pretty much. It's supposed to be 12 months, but actually we're at G Cloud 12. Next version, which will happen next year in 2022, will be G Cloud 13. G Cloud started actually in 2012, so my math isn't very good, but that appears to be, they appear to be like every 9 months or so. So you do get that level of change, of flexibility, because if it's not there today, it may be there tomorrow. And actually, as G Cloud has progressed through the years, it has actually changed its format as well. So it's always evolving, which is it's very, very useful and very disheartening for people like me. I think there are a couple of, I wouldn't say disadvantages, but there are a couple of issues people may need to be aware. The evaluation that suppliers undertake under G Cloud is a self-certification. It's not, whereas under our frameworks, we will actually undertake our process of evaluating the supplier's responses. As I said, you know, under G Cloud, it is just self-certification. The other potential downside is that because it's a CCS, it's Crown Commercial Services, it's not specifically directed to the HE market. So it may be that you know, because as we know, HE has very, very specific and very particular requirements. So it may be that actually what's on offer may not be tailored to specifically what the HE market is actually specifically looking for. And also as well, the other potential downside is that actually the terms and conditions that you will sign up to on the G Cloud is actually the supplier's terms and conditions. Our frameworks, it's actually our terms and conditions that we've actually agreed. So that actually has a benefit for the institutions, where, as Judy mentioned, that there can be, if you go it alone and not using a framework, that can be that length of time of wrangling about what terms and conditions and negotiation of those terms and conditions. If you go through a G Cloud route, those terms and conditions are already set up, and because they're supplier based, the suppliers will sign up to them PDQ. Okay. I think I know we're running for time. Is that sufficient?
Yes, I'll continue to talk about G Cloud now from a university perspective. So in preparation for actually, in fact, let's run a quick poll. Grace, can you pop up the third poll for me? I'm just interested in finding out if anyone has used G Cloud, if anyone's heard of it, used it as a route before today's session. So yeah, pop your answers in there if you've used it before, if you've heard of it and investigated but not used it yet, if you'd heard of it, or whether you hadn't heard of it before. So okay, so over half. I'll give you another 5 seconds for last few people. 3, 2, 1. Okay, excellent. Thanks then, Grace. So over half of you, first time you've heard about it. We'll talk about it for the next 5 or so additional minutes. And only 6 people have actually used it before. Okay, so definitely space for some more information on this. Thanks, Grace. So in terms of G Cloud, I did have a conversation before this with Dave Birchall, who's a procurement lead at Exeter University. He's the category manager down there for construction, but he picked up the timetabling procurement, and they use G Cloud as their route to procure a timetabling system. We talked about the steps that he went through and why they as an institution preferred the G Cloud route over the standard route. They did their market testing in pretty much the same way as they would have done for any procurement route, but he said that they were under some pressure from senior management to move quickly. And were looking to find a solution which was fairly so off the shelf. So they weren't looking for something bespoke. They wanted something that would work with their student record system directly as a plug-in to SITS as their student record system. So those two drivers, that it was needed to be quick and they were happy with an off-the-shelf solution, pointed them towards G-Cloud. They did their initial searches 7 or 8 months ago. He did talk about sort of G-Cloud, the supply list being refreshed on a 10 to 12 month cycle, as Mark talked about. There was only 2 timetabling systems on there at that time that met their specific requirements. So they then went into a further sort of competition between those two. They found G-Cloud fairly streamlined, and yes, as Mark said, G-Cloud has its own call-off contract. It is the supplier's terms and conditions. One disadvantage with G-Cloud is the length of contracts that are on offer. So the maximum length of contract that you can get through G-Cloud is 4 years, with a sort of start off at 2 + 1 + 1. And given what we've talked about implementation being a sort of 15 to 18 month project, that doesn't leave you much time at the other end to actually be using the system and getting on with it. Now, Exeter felt that the process that you can do after that 4 years of a sort of desktop competition, you can reevaluate the suppliers using the evaluation criteria that you set up at the beginning. And they felt that so 4 years didn't seem to be too big a risk to them at that point. In terms of when to use G-Cloud and when not to use G-Cloud, they've talked about the value of the system was small in comparison to some of the other systems, procurement that they've done. He said if off the shelf is viable, G-Cloud is a potential route. So think about what your minimum viable product is and how much sort of bespoking, how much niche functionality you need. One of the key advantages for them in G-Cloud is the ability to run test systems for a period of time and actually get to use and play with the systems. He used the example not of the timetabling piece, but of they recently used G-Cloud to procure a new exam system, and a lovely, beautiful written responses, with yes, no ticked, and one system had promised all of the functionality that they required, so scored very highly in first round, but actually in testing wasn't as usable as another solution, which perhaps met 85% of the functionality, but was much more usable. And interestingly, that 15% functionality was the stuff that they didn't even need in the first 1 or 2 years. It was sort of, nice to have stuff maybe that they wouldn't be able to implement immediately anyway. Last things that he said, G-Cloud as being a quicker route. Mark already talked about no mandatory standstill, no minimum timetables. He wouldn't use it. He would not use G-Cloud where you did need something that was more complicated than off the shelf, and he wouldn't use it for massive systems, so really high value things. It's just too much risk. His finance team wouldn't let him use the G-Cloud route. So that's sort of from the university side of things. Judy, do you want to come back in and just talk briefly about G-Cloud? Just a few minutes from the sort of supplier perspective, what your experience has been of it.
I'll whiz through this fairly quickly. So as Mark has explained, as a supplier, we have to register quite a lot of information on G-Cloud. So it's actually, if in that informal stage, you can actually just go up and have a look. That's all transparent. It's all public from all of the suppliers that are on G-Cloud. So you can compare quite a lot of information before you even let the supplier know that you're looking. It is being used more widely. This year it seems to be getting to be a little bit more popular. We've already had 2 universities who've come to us through this method. We've got a few others that are actually in the process of signing. So that's quite an increase in recent years. I have actually used G-Cloud myself from the other side. It is as everyone says, it's quite, in terms of transparent information, you've got everything that you need sort of up front. Why is it different? Well, as Mark alluded to, it has to be a genuine cloud-based system. So some suppliers refer to their systems as cloud when they're actually hosted or hybrids. They would not be allowed to be on the G Cloud. It is the government cloud, as Mark said, the clues in the name. It's different because you can get all this information in advance before you actually even sort of contact the supplier if you really wanted to. You can review the suppliers through G Cloud. You can create the contract through G Cloud as well. And as Claire has said, it's a two-year contract initially, and then you can extend it by 12 months twice. There are different rules around G Cloud. With a formal tender process, you have that cooling off window where other suppliers can appeal. With G Cloud, it's just a decision that's made and there's no opportunity to appeal it. So you don't have that cooling off period. The advantages, it is much faster. You're talking weeks rather than months. It is quite a transparent process. And because it's faster, it's actually going to save money in terms of internal resource that you have to dedicate to it. Having said that, I was going to call this disadvantages, but we're timetablers, so I've used the word constraints. As it's already been alluded to, there's that issue with the contract being 4 years. You can renew it, as Claire said, but you do have to do this desk-based market appraisal, and you have to document that. So, it's not a huge exercise. It's just something to bear in mind if you are going with G Cloud, that you need to factor that in. And just to be aware that the suppliers have to pay G Cloud a percentage of every invoice that we issue under the contract, and the contract is standard. So there's there's a lot less flexibility in terms of negotiation around the contract and things like that. So just bear that in mind. Still do your requirements. Really important to still have, if you're going to go G Cloud, to develop those requirements to use to assess the systems that are there. It'll be a little bit more focused though, because some of it, the information around the technical IT and the non-functional requirements would probably already be covered by the information that's up on G Cloud. So it's going to be a little bit of more simpler exercise. And I would still say always do your due diligence. It's hard to say quickly. It's really important to have that market engagement, to know what's out there before you make the decision to go with G Cloud. And that's it for me.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Judy. And thank you to all the panelists for taking part in today's and to providing us with those overviews. We've got some time now for question and answers. So thank you very much to those of you who popped some questions in the question and answer area and who've voted. There's still a little bit of time to do that if you want to do so. Panelists, if you all turn your videos on if you've popped them off. And we'll start with a question from Colin, who's asked, I think we'll start with directing this at you, Judy. So from a supplier perspective, is there a preference for a two-stage process? So an initial vetting process, and then once you've got to a short list of suppliers who can meet the majority of the sort of bits that you need, and then have that much more intense competition, if you like, with the, is that a preference from your side as well?
Realistically, it doesn't make that much difference to us. Most formal tenders are kind of run that way, even if it's not really official, because you submit your tender response, and then only those that meet the requirements then get invited on to do the demonstrations in the next stage, whether that's then a formal stage of submitting more information or things like that. It doesn't really, we don't really have a preference. I guess we would just follow the process that's been, yeah.
Okay. And in terms of, Mark, this might be a question for you. In terms of that, we talked in G Cloud about the possibility of like using the software and having it, if you like, in Sandpit and so forth. And is that sort of, are we able to do that within the more standard procurement route, or is that something that's we're very much dependent on that standard route, on the sort of written responses and the demonstration?
Sorry, Claire, could you just repeat that? It went a bit fuzzy.
Okay, so in the sort of standard route, the OJU process. Are universities able to access sort of test sites, test versions of software to play with that, or is that outside of that route?
Absolutely. No, so I mean, there are two ways you can go about this. The first way is as part of the pre-engagement with suppliers, and especially if you're talking something a little bit more complicated, then I would always recommend actually reaching out to the suppliers, undertaking that pre-engagement with the suppliers. It will help you build a specification. There aren't any particular rules against it. You've just got to be careful just to make sure that when you're writing the specification, you're not directing it to one person. I think there's a question there. So you can do that at the start and have that demonstration and have that play around with it. But also as well within the process, and in fact, actually we're doing it at the moment. We will be doing this at the moment for another one of our frameworks. And just when I apologize, when I talk about our frameworks, I'm talking about the frameworks not just for SUPC, but also the LUPC and the other Consortia frameworks. Sorry, I apologise. When I say our, I take ownership for everything. But yes, but for the forthcoming notebooks and desktop framework that's being run out of LUPC, we will actually be undertaking a review and analysis actually of the equipment that has been put forward. So yes, there is always that ability to run a sandbox. Okay.
Okay, and that sort of answers Colin's other question about whether, you know, in that engagement stage, you can have informal discussions with suppliers to help inform the sort of requirements and tenders. Okay, coming back to you, Judy, I'm going to ask a two-part question. So someone in Q&A has asked a question about, you know, the kind of efficiency or lack thereof in the tender process. So if there's a stage in the tender process which, you know, offers the least value for you as a supplier, what that might be. But also, you know, I think I had a potential question around how if there was one thing you could change about the process with your supplier hat on, what might that be?
So there isn't a stage that we would say. I guess the one thing I would say, and it kind of relates to the last point, is if you do request a sandbox data set, and we have had people request that from us both through GClear and through other tender processes, and give us your data set and we populate it. Please make sure you use it. We have had a couple where nobody's ever logged into it, so it's quite a bit of work on our side to put that together and import your data and set it up for you. So that would be the one thing I would say if you're going to ask and maybe change, because that does seem to be relatively common. And I understand that because timetables are busy and you want to get your team using it. So if you're going to request that, make sure you've got time allotted with your team to actually go in and use it and in a planned way. Otherwise it does tend to just be, oh, I'll look at that later, and then things get busy as they do in timetabling and it doesn't happen.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask a question. I'll ask a question to you all, and I'll come to Liz first, I guess. So we don't have a specific framework for timetabling systems for HE, and I guess we might be interested in that in the future. But is there possibility of universities working together around procurement in this area, joint procurement exercises, or coming together and working with one of the procurement consortia around a specific framework in this area?
I would think probably, but I think where you would struggle then is the diversity of the product that's put out at the end. Every university does timetabling slightly differently. And in my current experience, every department within a university does timetabling very differently. So I think it would be good to work together to set that up, but you would need very distinct products or variants on that product as the output.
Okay, and Mark, from a procurement perspective, around sort of higher education systems. Is there demand, we think, for a framework in this area?
I think it's definitely something that we would be useful to investigate. I think, you know, with the greatest respect, we are within myself, you know, there's only a small number of us.
Oh yeah.
And we have an awful lot of requests on time. I mean, there are things that we can do on this. I'm just going to lob in a hand grenade to count as a counterpoint to G-Cloud. Is actually we do have a framework that would support the procurement of timetabling already, and that is the SLRA, which is Lot 4. Bear in mind that timetabling is a standard off-the-shelf product, which is pretty much what the SLRA framework is all about. So there is that as an opportunity, but we'll put that to one side. Yeah, I mean,
what does SLRA stand
sorry,
for?
I apologise. I've gone into acronyms. It's the Software License Resellers Agreement. Okay.
Thank you.
And unlike G-Cloud, this particular lot has a wide variance and one opportunity, but it's not specific actually to cloud-based solutions. Okay, so it can be both. It can be on premise as well. Apologies, Dan. So yeah, so there is that opportunity. It may be. What I would suggest is if people have a real requirement for us to look at a timetabling software, is write to your local procurement ICT category manager. So that's myself for the south, Mike Kilner for London, David Yates for the northwest, etc. Okay, Mike McLaughlin and Paul Eagleton. Reach out to them, ask the question. If we can see that there is sufficient demand, then yes, it may be that we won't actually do an actual framework. But actually what possibly we could do is actually build some sort of guidance notes to help support institutions when they're actually reaching out to the market, give them help and guidance, because it's you know, very clear that you know, there is an awful lot of stuff that we can do in terms of explaining, you know, what you can and can't do in the process.
Okay, brilliant. I think we're pretty much coming to the end of our time there. The questions that haven't been answered, we'll gather them together. We're going to send around the recording. Judy's going to share her slides and so much, and we will try and we'll look through chat and we'll try and address any of the questions and sort of share that information across the delegate list. So thank you very much to the panelists today, to Mark, to Judy and to Liz for stepping in. Thank you very much to Grace and Helen, who behind the scenes have done a lot of work to get today's event set up and to support the webinar. Thank you to all of you as delegates for joining us today. As I said, we'll be in touch sometime over the next week or so with a link to the recording and to any information. If there's any support that you would like in this process, as Mark said, reach out to your local procurement consortia, reach out across your institutions to your procurement specialists, and reach out to SUMS if you'd like further support and information. As it's December, it's obligatory for me to wish you all the best in the run-up towards the break. I hope everyone has a wonderful Christmas break, and thank you very much for attending. Thank you.